I'm joined today by international relations expert Philippe Assouline. Philippe, it's great to talk to you as always. You know, we've had now the sort of coming together of two separate Middle East issues. One is that of ISIS, and the other is that of Hamas control in Gaza. Of course, the West Bank in Israel under the control of the Palestinian Authority, but Hamas in control in Gaza. Talk to us first a little bit about the logistics. When we read that ISIS is increasingly in Gaza, what does that mean?
So it's a very good question. So first of all, thank you for having me again. It's always a pleasure to be on your show. So ISIS being in Gaza doesn't exactly mean ISIS and al-Baghdadi or the Central Command in Iraq and Syria are controlling what's happening in Gaza. It's important to understand, without wanting to complicate the issues too much, that Palestinian politics are riven by clan and faction loyalties. And in Gaza now, because Hamas is short of money, because it has not really achieved much in terms of war with Israel, etc., there's some clans that are starting to assert themselves and challenge Hamas's rule in Gaza. The way they're doing that is tapping into ideology. The society now is becoming more and more Islamist, ironically under the influence of Hamas. And so they're using Salafist ideology, which is to implement the caliphate not later, but now. And there's some kind of echo of loyalty to ISIS, but it's not exactly a direct organizational link. It's more of like an organic thing where these clans are using what they can to justify their grab for power.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the Salafists have been in Gaza for a long time. That's not new, but the sort of decision by some to ally with ISIS or represent the ISIS message, that's what's new.
Right. So the Salafists have been in Gaza and in the Sinai for quite some time. I think if there's a new element, it's their aggressive moves in the Sinai against the Egyptian army. And Hamas is actually cooperating with the Salafists or ISIS, more closely associated with ISIS in the Sinai, which is at the border of Gaza, so as to ensure the tunnels. And in Gaza, they're fighting each other. The allegiance to ISIS, exactly as you're pointing out, is part of this new trend of these groups around the world who want to either ennoble themselves or legitimize themselves or be part of whatever is, has a bit of celebrity, unfortunately. And that's why they claim connection to ISIS. I don't think there's any tight organizational link now, more so in the Sinai, actually. There might be some actual connections in the Sinai, but not as much in Gaza for now.
Increasingly, there's this very interesting, I don't really like calling it a test case because it sounds like you're running experiments, but there's a sort of de facto test case happening now in the West Bank and in Gaza, whereas the West Bank is under Palestinian Authority control longer and longer, and Gaza is under the control of Hamas, and now we have these ISIS-aligned Salafists. We're seeing that the Israeli relationship to, quote, Palestinians, broadly speaking, actually does differ based on what is going on the ground, because we see that the interactions with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank now are very different than what's going on in Gaza. And it's sort of evidence we can point to say, actually, what is possible with Palestinians really does vary depending on who's in charge.
Yeah, the leadership definitely is a huge element. There's a schism among Palestinians now that's remarkable. The Israeli government, for right or wrong, has decided that the Palestinian society does not really support Abbas. So Abbas now is running the West Bank with the support, massive support from America and Israeli security forces. And the idea is if they remove themselves, he will be toppled by Islamists the next day. I don't know if I agree with that, but there's definitely a completely different climate in the West Bank, which is now generally peaceful. I mean, there's always terror attacks and violence. Hamas is trying to instigate things. But generally, the West Bank is doing much better. Since Defensive Shield, the operation against terrorism in 2002, there's been a remarkable change. Real estate has gone up. The economy is getting better. Compare that to Gaza, where you have high unemployment, where you have an Islamist group in power, where there's war every few years. It's almost if you're dealing with two completely separate entities. And Hamas won't let the PA back in. The discussion in Israel now is, should Israel have removed Hamas? Should it remove Hamas with the help of Egypt and put the PA? Or should it keep Hamas because if it removes it, ISIS is what is going to take control?
Well, I think there's another, Philippe, if I can, I think there's another sort of consideration. And I talked to, when I was in Israel last week, I talked to both Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis about this. The consensus in Israel seems to be that any time that Israel wants to remove Hamas from power in the Gaza Strip, that they would be able to do it. And the speculation from both Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis that I spoke to was, if Israel chooses to do that, they no longer have any reason to explain why they continue without conceding certain elements that other groups may want them to concede, and that they would have no real reason not to have more earnest and open negotiations, and that it sort of may serve as a way for the current right-wing government of Israel, which you and I have criticized before, to avoid having to make those concessions.
I think that's a fair criticism. Personally, I think it has value, but it's part of this debate I was pointing to. A lot of people in Israel think that if you remove Hamas, what you'll get is not the PA, what you'll get is ISIS. Another part of the population, I think a substantial one, thinks that if you remove Hamas, which you could with the help of Egypt, you could put in the PA and have a stable running government and then have negotiations. And that Bibi Netanyahu prefers to have the Palestinians split because it spares him the pressure of having to negotiate with a partner he doesn't trust. Now everything's in flux. The Hamas movement is starting to move away from Iran, apparently, closer to the Saudis. Abbas is talking about his retirement soon. So I don't expect anything to happen in the next few weeks or months. But I think you're absolutely right. A substantial part of the population in Israel thinks this is a cop-out. It's a way to leave the Palestinians divided and not put pressure on Israel. However, that said, I'm always wary of arguments that put the entire onus on Israel. The Palestinian Authority has also the responsibility to unify itself to be a viable negotiating partner. I don't think Israel should necessarily bear the entire responsibility for unifying them.
No, I completely agree. Although when we do think about what's happened in practice, we've seen, we've seen Hamas fight the Palestinian Authority, including very violently. And you could argue it would. I guess what I'm saying is, if you, as the Palestinian Authority, were to say, "Listen, look at what they did to us," you could make a pretty strong argument that it would be tough for them to really exert any influence or power there.
You mean for the PA to exert power?
Exactly.
Yeah. Listen, it's a recurring argument. The legitimacy of the PA is a very real question. It's something that people have grappled with since the beginning of Oslo, which ties into what I think is an extremely important element of this and an extremely important process going on now. A lot of people watching what ISIS is doing, watching what Islamism is doing in the Middle East, are starting to reassess ideologically. I think, unfortunately, it's happening slower in the Palestinian territories, at least in Gaza. But it has to be part of the equation. You can't not impose, as important as leaders are, as you rightly pointed out, I don't think you can impose peace if the people are not there yet. And part of the process has to happen organically by looking at these failed Islamist experiments, as it's happened in Egypt to a large extent, as it's happened in other places in the Middle East. And that would contribute to the legitimacy of the PA. But the current leadership of the PA is old, it's considered corrupt, it's considered to be a kleptocracy. That's also a very real problem, right? Hamas got elected because of its ideology, but also because it was seen as less corrupt than the PA.
You talked a little bit about this or alluded to it, but is there some way in which this ISIS potentially versus Hamas in Gaza could lead to something positive in terms of renewing real negotiations, broadly speaking, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
It depends how much of a grassroots support it has. Like I said, this is based on clan loyalties, clan affiliations, clan struggles. If it's two of the largest families, for example, that were to support the Salafists, you'd have a very hard time changing the opinion of people. If it's some fringe element and it brings suffering to the people and they see what's going on in the Middle East, you could start to have a change. So it really depends on how much of a grassroots support you have for this. It depends on what's happening around. It depends on how Egypt plays into this. There's a whole world of Arab politics internally that we tend to ignore here that would contribute to it. That said, I think Israel could make some moves now to help the situation. But Abbas, I'm not sure that he is the best candidate for Israel to do that with. And he's going to retire soon, so maybe we'll see some positive change.
There's no question there will be a lot to follow as that takes place and as we continue to follow these movements in Gaza. Let me remind everybody, we've been speaking with Philippe Assouline, international relations expert. Always great to have you on.
Always nice to be on. Thank you very much.